Sorry, that seat's reserved for actual family, my aunt sneered, gesturing toward a folding chair by the snack rack. No one addressed me until the $3,000 bill arrived. It landed in front of me. I just grinned, grabbed my jacket, and told the waiter, "Ask the actual family." I, 29M, still remember the exact moment my world shifted, standing in that overpriced restaurant, holding a jacket that suddenly felt like armor, watching my aunt's face drain of color as the waiter approached our table with a leather folder that would change everything. But let me back up to where this mess really started. 3 months ago, I got the call about my grandfather's funeral arrangements. My aunt, Dad's older sister, had taken charge of everything, which wasn't surprising since she'd always positioned herself as the family matriarch after Grandma died 5 years earlier. What was surprising was how she'd managed to turn even a funeral into a power play. The service itself went smoothly enough. I sat in the back, paid my respects, and tried to ignore the pointed looks from various relatives who seemed to have collectively decided I was somehow lesser than the rest of them. My crime? I'd chosen a different path after college, freelance graphic design, instead of the corporate ladder everyone expected me to climb. Apparently, this made me the family disappointment. After the cemetery, my aunt announced there would be a celebration of life dinner at Romano's, the kind of upscale Italian place that charges $40 for pasta and calls it artisanal. She made a big show of inviting everyone, rattling off names and table assignments like she was organizing a wedding. When she got to me, her voice took on that particular tone, the one that sounds polite on the surface but carries enough ice to freeze hell over. She told me there wasn't really space at the main tables with the actual family, but they'd set up a lovely spot for me by the appetizer station where I could still feel included. I should have left right then. Should have made some excuse about work or a prior commitment. Instead, I found myself following the procession to Romano's, telling myself it was about honoring Grandpa's memory, not about proving anything to these people. The restaurant buzzed with the kind of forced cheer that comes with family gatherings nobody really wants to attend. 3 large tables dominated the private dining room, draped in white linens and set with the good silverware. And there, exactly as promised, sat a single folding chair next to a cart loaded with bruschetta and stuffed mushrooms. My aunt caught me looking and smiled that razor-thin smile she'd perfected over the years. She gestured toward my designated spot and delivered her line with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Sorry, that seat's reserved for actual family." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were particularly cruel. I'd heard worse from her over the years, but because of the timing. We'd just buried the man who used to sneak me extra cookies when I was 7 and taught me to play chess on rainy afternoons. Grandpa never cared about my job or my lack of a traditional career path. He just cared that I was happy. But there I was, being relegated to the kids' table equivalent because I didn't fit their narrow definition of success. I took my seat without complaint, watched as cousins and second cousins filled the real tables, listened to toast after toast about family bonds and staying connected. Nobody addressed me directly. Nobody asked how I was holding up. I might as well have been part of the furniture. The isolation gave me time to observe, though, and what I observed was fascinating. My aunt held court at the head table like some sort of benevolent dictator, orchestrating conversations and managing the flow of wine with military precision. She'd order rounds of drinks for the table, recommend the most expensive entrees, insist that everyone try the chef's special dessert tasting menu. Her husband nodded along to everything, playing the role of supportive spouse, while she spent what I was beginning to realize was probably significant money. See, here's what nobody else seemed to be paying attention to. My aunt and her husband had been struggling financially for months. I knew because my dad had mentioned it in passing a few weeks earlier, something about them borrowing money for their son's college tuition and maybe getting in over their heads with credit card debt. But watching her performance that night, you'd never guess they had financial troubles. She was playing the generous matriarch role to perfection, picking up the tab for 30 people without blinking. About halfway through dinner, something clicked in my brain. A memory from earlier in the week, when I'd helped my dad sort through some of Grandpa's papers. There had been a conversation about the will, about how Grandpa had made some specific provisions for the funeral expenses. Dad had mentioned that whoever organized the service would be reimbursed from the estate, but there were strict limits on what qualified as reasonable expenses. I pulled out my phone and did some quick math based on what I was seeing around me. Appetizers, multiple rounds of drinks, premium entrees, wine pairings, that dessert-tasting menu my aunt had insisted everyone try. The numbers were adding up fast, and they were adding up to way more than any reasonable funeral expense. My aunt had turned Grandpa's memorial dinner into her own personal power trip, and she was planning to stick the estate with the bill. The estate that would eventually be divided among all of us, meaning she was essentially stealing from the family to fund her performance. The realization should have made me angry, but instead I found myself oddly calm. Maybe it was the clarity that comes with finally understanding someone's true motivations, or maybe I was just tired of being treated like a second-class relative. I finished my surprisingly good chicken parmigiana. Might as well enjoy the meal I was about to pay for in more ways than one, and waited. The evening wound down with more toasts and promises to stay in touch that everyone knew were empty. People started gathering their coats and purses, making the usual post-dinner small talk about traffic and babysitters. That's when the waiter appeared with the leather folder. He approached our little gathering with the practiced discretion of someone who delivered many expensive bills to many wealthy families. But instead of heading to my aunt at the head table, he made a beeline straight for me. "Sir, your bill for this evening." The folder landed in front of me with the weight of inevitability. I didn't need to open it to know what I'd find, but I did anyway. The total made my eyes water. Just over $3,000 for food and drinks that I'd barely been allowed to participate in consuming. Conversations around me started to die as people noticed what was happening. My aunt looked up from her animated discussion about vacation plans, and I saw the exact moment she registered the scene unfolding. I closed the leather folder carefully, making sure the total was visible to anyone who might be curious. Then I stood up, grabbed my jacket from the back of that folding chair, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. More like a settling into place of all the puzzle pieces I'd been collecting over the years. I caught the waiter's attention and smiled, genuinely smiled, maybe for the first time all evening. "Ask the actual family." The words came out clear and confident, carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone in the private dining room heard them. I didn't rush or stumble over the delivery. I just stated a simple fact and started walking toward the exit. Behind me, the silence stretched for about 3 seconds before exploding into chaos. My aunt's voice rose above the others, sharp with panic as she tried to explain to the waiter that there'd been some mistake, that of course she was planning to pay, that I was being ridiculous and dramatic. But I was already gone, pushing through the restaurant's main dining room while the sounds of family drama echoed behind me. Other diners looked up from their meals with the kind of morbid curiosity that expensive restaurant scenes tend to generate. I made it to my car before my phone started buzzing. Update 1. The call started before I even got home that night. My dad, confused and wanting to know what had happened at the restaurant. A couple of cousins who'd witnessed the scene and were either outraged on my behalf or furious that I'd embarrassed the family, depending on their perspective. I ignored most of them, but I did answer when my dad called, because he deserved an explanation. I told him everything. The folding chair, the dismissive treatment, the realization about the bill, and what my aunt was trying to pull with the estate money. I explained how she'd positioned herself as the generous host while planning to make Grandpa's estate foot the bill for her performance. Dad was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he told me he'd handle it, and hung up. The next morning brought a series of increasingly desperate text messages from my aunt. First attempts at justification. She'd made an honest mistake about the payment arrangements. Surely I understood that family gatherings were complicated to organize. Then bargaining. Maybe we could split the bill somehow, work out a payment plan that made sense for everyone. When I didn't respond, the messages turned nastier. I was selfish and ungrateful. I'd embarrassed the entire family over a simple misunderstanding. Grandpa would be ashamed of my behavior. That last one almost got to me. Almost. But then I remembered sitting in that folding chair, watching her play Queen Bee while treating me like hired help, and I deleted the messages without responding. The real fun started 3 days later when I got a call from Romano's. The manager explained that there had been some confusion about payment for a recent private party, and they were hoping to resolve the matter quickly and discreetly. It seemed the party organizer was having some difficulty covering the full amount, and they wondered if I might be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. I told them I'd be happy to clarify my position. I explained that I had been seated separately from the actual family, had not been consulted about any menu choices or expenses, and had made my payment intentions clear when I left. If they needed to pursue collection, they should focus their efforts on the people who had actually organized and enjoyed the dinner. The manager thanked me for my time and hung up. I never heard from Romanos again, but I did hear from my dad again that afternoon. He'd been doing some investigating of his own, apparently. Turns out my aunt's financial situation was even worse than we'd realized. The funeral dinner hadn't been her only attempt to leverage family events for personal gain. She'd been skimming money from various family gatherings for months, always with elaborate justifications about organization costs and family unity. Dad had also been in touch with Grandpa's lawyer about the estate reimbursement policies. The funeral home charges and basic reception costs would be covered, but anything beyond simple refreshments was explicitly excluded. My aunt had known this when she planned the Romanos' dinner, but had apparently assumed she could pressure the family into covering the excess costs rather than admit she couldn't afford her grand gesture. Update 2. 2 weeks after the dinner, I got an unexpected visitor. My cousin Sarah showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning, looking uncomfortable but determined. She'd been at one of the main tables that night, close enough to witness everything but far enough from the action to avoid the immediate fallout. She wanted to apologize. Sarah explained that she'd watched the whole scene unfold and had been bothered by it ever since. She'd seen how I was treated, how my aunt had deliberately marginalized me, and how everyone else had just gone along with it because it was easier than making waves. But what really got to her was what happened after I left. Apparently, my aunt had spent the rest of the evening trying to convince various family members to chip in for the bill. She'd made increasingly desperate pitches about family loyalty and shared responsibility, growing more shrill and manipulative as people started declining to contribute. My uncle, her own husband, had finally ended the performance by putting his credit card down and telling the waiter to charge the full amount. Sarah said his face had looked like stone, and my aunt had spent the rest of the evening in tight-lipped silence. The marriage had been tense ever since, according to family gossip. Turns out my uncle hadn't known about the extent of their financial problems or his wife's creative accounting methods. The Romanos' bill had been his first real glimpse into how deep the hole had gotten. Sarah also brought news about the broader family reaction. Opinion was split, but not in the way I'd expected. The older generation was largely horrified by my disrespectful behavior, but most of the younger family members were quietly supportive. Several people had apparently been harboring their own resentments about my aunt's controlling behavior over the years, and my dramatic exit had given them permission to start voicing their complaints. I appreciated Sarah's visit, but I told her she didn't need to apologize. She hadn't organized the dinner or chosen my seating arrangement. She'd just been trying to get through an awkward family gathering, same as everyone else. But her information did give me some satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed my aunt's suffering. I'm not that petty. But because the truth was finally coming out. All those years of carefully managed family politics and strategic positioning, and it had taken one overpriced dinner to pull back the curtain. Update 3. The final chapter of this story came 6 weeks later at Grandpa's estate settlement meeting. The lawyer had called a family meeting to distribute assets and settle final expenses. Nothing dramatic. Grandpa hadn't been wealthy enough for dynasty-level intrigue, but there were some savings, the house, and a few sentimental items to divvy up. My aunt attended. But the woman who walked into that conference room was a shadow of the commanding presence who'd held court at Romanos. She looked tired and smaller somehow, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy load and had finally been forced to set it down. The estate expenses were straightforward. Funeral home costs, burial plot, flowers, and a simple reception at the church fellowship hall. All reasonable and all covered as planned. No mention of Romanos or any additional dinner expenses. But the lawyer did have some interesting information about Grandpa's final wishes. Turns out he'd left specific instructions about the distribution of his personal items. Most of it was standard stuff: his wedding ring to my dad, some jewelry to the female grandchildren, his tools to the boys who might use them. But there was one bequest that caught everyone by surprise. Grandpa had left me his chess set. Not just any chess set, but the antique wooden set we'd used for all those rainy afternoon games when I was a kid. The note attached to the bequest was brief but clear. For my grandson who always thought 3 moves ahead. I almost laughed out loud when the lawyer read that part. Grandpa had seen something in me all those years ago, some quality my aunt and her crowd had consistently overlooked. Strategic thinking, maybe, or just the patience to see situations fully before making moves. The meeting wrapped up with handshakes and awkward small talk. People dispersed to their cars, carrying boxes of photos and keepsakes, and whatever complicated feelings family gatherings always generate. My aunt caught up with me in the parking lot. She didn't apologize exactly. That would have required acknowledging fault, and some people aren't built for that kind of honesty. Instead, she talked around the edges of what had happened, making vague references to misunderstandings and poor communication. I listened politely, but I didn't engage with the revisionist history she was trying to construct. Some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt just because it would be convenient. As I loaded Grandpa's chess set into my trunk, I thought about that night at Romano's and how satisfying it had been to finally stop playing by rules that were rigged against me from the start. The funny thing is, I never wanted to embarrass anyone or cause family drama. I just got tired of being treated like a second-class relative and decided to stop accepting it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or calculated. Sometimes it's just refusing to participate in someone else's performance, walking away from a table where you were never really welcome, and letting the natural consequences unfold. My aunt wanted to play the role of generous family matriarch, funded by money that wasn't really hers to spend. When that performance fell apart, it wasn't because I destroyed it. It was because it was built on a foundation that couldn't support its own weight. I still think about Grandpa sometimes, especially when I'm setting up his chess set for games with friends. He taught me that the most powerful moves often look simple on the surface, but they're the result of seeing the whole board clearly. That night at Romano's, I finally learned to play the game the way he'd been trying to teach me all along. The reserved seat, it turns out, was never really about where I was sitting. It was about understanding my own worth and refusing to let other people's limitations define my place in the world. And sometimes, the best way to claim your spot at the table is to stand up and walk away from it entirely.